informative and enlightening. My name is Silja Ómarsdóttir. I'm a professor of international affairs at the University of Iceland and research director at FIIA Peace Center. And it is absolutely wonderful to be here, having worked with Pia and the staff at the Institute for almost a decade now in developing the center and seeing how it has grown to have this amazing event here. Of course, having it here in Harpa, of course, is especially pleasing. This is a wonderful location to be. I'm joined today by 5 colleagues. 3 will be here in the room and 2 online. We will start with a short introductory remarks from Cedric de Coning, who is a research professor at NUPI, our sister institute in Norway. And here on the stage, if you would join me, are going to be Emma Hakala, Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Minoo Koefoed, Senior Research Fellow at NUPI, the Nordic Institute of International Affairs, and Kyungmee Kim, Senior Researcher at the Swedish International Peace Research Institute. And online, also from NUPI, will be Tobias Etzold, who is also a Senior Research Fellow there. So if my colleagues would join me up on the stage, and then we will switch to online remarks. Cedric, you're here. Wonderful to see you, and thank you for the email this morning that we have a research report that's going to be published on Nordic collaboration with Africa on peace and security next week. Quite different from the topic that we're talking about today, but still the climate implications certainly are equally relevant. We now have all our colleagues here. I know you can't see us, Cedric, but I will hand over to you for a few comments before we get started.
Thank you so much, Silja, and good morning, everyone. I regret that I'm not able to be with you in person this morning, especially since I was part of the initiative to pull this panel together, also as part of our Nordic and Baltic climate security network that is focused in on this region, on this topic rather. But I appreciate very much the opportunity to make some opening remarks. Let me start by saying that we know that the gradual rise in global temperatures, which we commonly refer to as climate change, is already disrupting weather patterns, changing ecosystems, and exacerbating environmental degradation. These changes are happening faster in the Nordic region than in the rest of the world, and are already resulting in the melting of Arctic ice, permafrost, and glaciers. Over time, this will lead to, among other things, rising sea levels that would make some coastal zones where most people in the Nordic region currently live uninhabitable in this century. Climate change is also expected to increase the scope and frequency of extreme weather events, such as droughts, floods, and heat waves, which will have an impact on the primary industries in the Nordic region, including agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And these climate-related stresses, in combination with factors such as increased global rivalry for natural resources and a changing global order, will exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and drive compounding and cascading effects that may undermine the resilience of communities and institutions in the Nordic region, and that could have a negative impact on social cohesion and human security. Some effects of climate change, such as seasonal changes in the polar ice cap, has also increased hard security risks in the Arctic region. And I know Tobias will talk more about this later. The Arctic region is becoming more accessible to shipping and extractive industries, and this may increasingly lead to an Arctic scramble that will exacerbate geopolitical tensions in the Nordic region. However, it's important to also stress that cooperation to manage shared natural resources like fish stocks or to cope with transboundary natural disasters can also contribute to sustaining peace in our region by strengthening social cohesion and societal resilience. The impact of climate change on our lives is not predetermined by our exposure to climate change. Climate change may influence our options, but we can choose how to respond to these climate-related stresses. And the choices we make under stress from climate and environmental causes is influenced by our adaptive capacity and resilience. And we can influence these negative effects of climate change by, firstly, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, slowing biodiversity loss, and taking other steps to prevent environmental degradation. But also, secondly, by investing in those capacities that will enable us to adapt, including especially our social cohesion and societal resilience. This panel this morning will discuss the profound implications that climate change will have for our present and future human and hard security, but also the opportunities we have to influence how we build and sustain peace, including in the Nordic region. So with these few words, I wish you a fruitful exchange of ideas and suggestions, and back to you, Silja.
So much, Cedric. We're going to start here on the stage, and then we will welcome your colleague Tobias with us online. Cedric mentioned many issues that we need to think about when it comes to climate change, and each of you are going to bring a different perspective and the impact of climate change on peace and security in the Nordic region. And I wonder if I could start with you, Emma. You are looking specifically at the geopolitical risks that accompany climate change in the Nordic region. So do you want to get us started?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is a really interesting and very nice event, I think. But I think Cedric already covered quite well the sort of basics of how these, especially he mentioned these cascading and compound impacts of climate change, which I think that I will be talking about quite a lot. And I think that it's important to understand that there are such risks associated with climate change, because I think that in the Nordic countries we have tended to maybe think that we are relatively safe from climate change. We are in many ways resilient. We have relatively strong democracies and are relatively wealthy countries, and also maybe the direct risks of climate change are expected to be a bit less severe than in some other parts of the world. But I think that this is partly also a kind of an illusion that we have sort of wanted to tag on to somehow. And we tend to forget that at the same time we are also very reliant on exports and imports and on the multilateral world system. So in that sense, the kinds of impacts that climate change has on at the sort of more systemic level are going to be very relevant for the Nordic countries. And kind of to make it a bit easier to tackle, I guess, I tend to categorize the sort of security impacts of climate change into three categories. So first there are the direct impacts, which are the sort of extreme weather and flooding, things like that, that directly affect our security. But then we have what I call the cascading impacts, where climate change is associated with all kinds of societal, economic, and geopolitical impacts. So these could be issues like forced migration, or in some cases conflict, and supply chain disruptions and things like that. And it's important to note in these kinds of impacts that it is not only climate change, but the combination of its impact with other factors. And then finally, we have the transition impacts, which are associated with mitigating and adapting to climate change, because we have left it so late in a way that we need to make such structural systemic changes that they will inevitably have some effect on our security, which is not to say that we shouldn't be mitigating climate change, of course. And all of these are somehow reflected geopolitically also on the Nordic countries. So for example, if we look at even in Europe, we've had very sort of severe extreme weather, like the heat waves in the past years. And even though, if I think from the point of view of my own country, Finland, this hasn't directly actually impacted Finland so much. We haven't, for example, last summer we didn't have a heat wave. We had a rather poor or normal Finnish summer. But the implications of what happens in Europe or the continental Europe has impacts on Finland and on its security. So, for example, when the cooling of nuclear power plants is inhibited due to low water levels and also overly heated water, that will, through various chains of effects, have impacts on the price of energy, and therefore may have, especially if this is again associated with some geopolitical impacts, like now we had the Russian attack on Ukraine, this will have economic impacts also for Finland. And I think as we go further and the implications of climate change become more severe, then we are also in Europe dealing with political issues, and some countries, especially in the south, being more severely impacted than the countries in the north. How do we then, do we come up with some sort of recompensation system to enable these southern countries to adapt better, and whether in the political climate that we have now, there will actually be space for that kind of a development, or whether the EU will actually end up somehow increasingly disintegrating or developing into these sort of regions within EU, or whether these impacts will then feed into all kinds of populist discourses in the EU member countries. I think that even though these sound maybe a little bit exaggerated visions of the future, I think unfortunately they are not, as we have also maybe seen in the past few years, that the political situation can change very fast. So what I would also like to then point out is a little bit what Cedric was also saying, that it is up to us to adapt and to come up with solutions. And of course, with these kinds of geopolitical impacts, it's unfortunately rather difficult to prevent them, because they are dependent on such different kinds of factors, and often they develop through such complicated chains of effects. But I don't think that that means that we should at least try to foresee them and to come up with some sort of preparedness measures against them. And if we are able to follow these weather impacts and then as they are starting to develop, for example, a heat wave in Europe, we can kind of monitor the political situation and somehow try to foresee what kinds of impacts we might be dealing with. And the last point that I want to make is that I really think that the Nordic countries should increasingly cooperate on this kind of preparedness together, because I think that the impacts that we are going to be seeing and dealing with are going to be very similar. So we would really benefit from exchanging information and coming up with all kinds of preparedness systems together, rather than all countries doing it on their own. But I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. If we look at another aspect of security, Minoo, you work on social cohesion, resilience, and human security, which of course all is severely affected by climate change. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Very happy to be both in Reykjavik and at this forum, very interesting and important event. Yes, so when considering social cohesion and human security as it connects to climate change, we tend to think of impacts of catastrophic natural disasters and humanitarian crises emerging from extreme weather events, often in the global southern countries, countries that perhaps experience and see the consequences of climate change in a different way than we normally do here in the north. Especially countries with high levels of pre-existing socio-economic vulnerabilities, such as extreme poverty, dependency on subsistence agriculture, or countries affected by existing and prolonged violent conflicts, are often also less resilient to tackle the negative impacts of climate change. Extreme weather events, heat waves, and prolonged rainfalls causing droughts, flooding, soil erosion, land degradation, shrinking agricultural land, and reduction of food and freshwater sources, put additional pressure on resources which are already scarce. In many cases, this has an adverse impact on social cohesion and could increase existing tensions within or between communities, or even lead to eruptions of violence. Financially disadvantaged and conflict-ridden countries in the global south also tend to have fewer financial opportunities to adapt to climate change, which otherwise could have had a positive impact on resilience. This all becomes a vicious circle where multiple vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities, down-spiraling national economies, and climate vulnerabilities feed into each other and reinforce each other. The imbalance in how hard which countries are hit by the negative effects of climate change in that sense also intersects with global inequalities. So in the Nordic region, the contextual situation is so different that we need also to think differently when seeking to understand the connections between climate change on the one hand and social cohesion, resilience, and human security on the other. Although extreme weather events do not lead to humanitarian disasters, perhaps in the Nordics, as they often do in other parts of the world, the Nordic region struggles with serious environmental challenges. Some examples are biodiversity loss, altered ecosystems, melting glaciers, excessive waste stemming from overconsumption, and the limited circular economy which reinforces the former, to mention only some. The Nordic region is also home to indigenous peoples who are more vulnerable to the negative effects of climate change because they, to a larger extent than others, are dependent on the nature, functional ecosystems, and biodiversity for their subsistence and cultural survival as peoples. Furthermore, high material standards, consumption patterns, and a pretty enormous ecological footprint also characterize the Nordics. As a matter of fact, we have amongst the highest CO2 emissions per capita in the world. In addition, there are also high levels of social trust, trust in public institutions, and high level of social cohesion in this region. This combination, I think, actually placed the Nordic states in an excellent position when it comes to allocate the needed financial and human resources to effectively engage in climate mitigation and adaptation, which in sum creates very favorable conditions for deepening our local resilience to climate change. And Nordic governments have adopted what appears to be fairly ambitious plans and policies aiming to reduce our ecological footprint through, for instance, green transition initiatives. However, I argue that the way some of these projects relate with local and affected communities, and in particular indigenous Sami communities, run the risk of undermining their potential usefulness as green projects and lead to negative and unintended social, environmental, and cultural consequences. So I will then turn to the Norwegian context, which I know the best. So green transition and extractive initiatives in the shape of wind power plant construction on land is one example of a source of social and political tension in affected areas, as projects and concessions for years have been implemented with little, insufficient, or no consultation or consensus with local populations. Climate mitigation and adaptation initiatives, when applied in manners which do not sufficiently consider the local interests, needs, grievances, cultural practices, or local knowledge in those areas, may lead to local anger, resistance, and distrust in established politics and political parties, and thereby threaten the social cohesion that we are so proud of in the Nordics. And in the case of Norway, we continue to construct green wind power farms on indigenous Sami land, despite what seems to be widespread opposition by local and indigenous communities. Sami communities in Øyfjellet and Fosen, for instance, are two such examples. The Sami communities there experience that reindeer avoid grazing in areas where they can see or hear wind turbines, and they can also disrupt the migration of reindeer, which is of crucial importance in the winter months. A study by Susanne Normann from the University of Oslo shows that the reindeer herding is key to Southern Sami cultural survival, both in terms of language, knowledge transfers, and cultural belonging. She shows that the Green Transition Project with wind power as example represents an historical continuation of a process where the foundations for the future continuation of reindeer herding are gradually reduced. Sami communities thereby become exposed to a double burden of climate change, one considering direct and negative impacts of climate change, and the other on the adaptation measures implemented to combat climate change. Earlier this year, there were massive, long-lasting protests and demonstrations occurring in front of the Norwegian Parliament in Oslo, where Sami activists for weeks chained themselves to the entrances of different governmental departments to protest against what they saw as human rights violations on indigenous rights with regards to the wind power park in Fosen indigenous Sami land. And a High Court decision also confirmed their experience. Actually, today there's new demonstrations and a camp in front of the Norwegian Parliament on the same case I read in the news this morning. And as a matter of fact, court cases against wind power projects, which is a part of the green transition, on the basis that they violate Sami indigenous rights, are popping up in several different parts of the country. I would like to end then with a kind of proposition or something to think about in terms of policy making, and that is that I think that it's important to keep in mind that political and social polarization might be the result when decisions are taken without sufficiently consider the grievances of local population, or when not applying a holistic and rights-based understanding when assessing the impacts on climate change and the environment in favor of a very narrow focus where the ecological footprint is reduced to emissions alone. We have to think holistically. Thank you.
Thank you, Minoo. Very interesting points. And where you started out with the different settings that we're dealing with, the picture that we get in our minds of the South versus the impact that we have to deal with in the Nordic region and our social context. And I think that leads us nicely into Kyungmee's intervention, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about how the Nordics can engage in this conversation at the global level. What can our contributions be to peace and security and climate change?
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. So I'm Kyungmee, and I'm from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So we have been working with this climate-related security issues for quite some time. I think we're one of the first organizations that focuses on peace and security to work on this issue. So now the conversation has more shifted towards climate, peace, security, which makes a different connotation from just talking about climate change and security. So we now look more broadly, what are the contributions that climate resilient actions can also have for peace building. So forming this still ongoing global debate in multilateral settings, like at the UN and also at the EU, even in NATO, OSCE, various organizations, actually the footprints of the Nordic countries have been quite significant. So I think so I have thought about this in three different ways. So first way is this institutional platforms where the Nordic countries have been the champion of this agenda. So I think Sweden, Norway have been in the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member states, and they have really pushed this agenda forward. And now the European membership is with Switzerland, so it's not with the Nordic country, but I think still the agenda is high on the Council, and the contribution from Norway and also from previously Sweden has been highly recognized, and that's a kind of a primary example of how, well, small countries, we can say, make a big footprint in global discussions, important global discussions. So related to this, so this climate, peace, security, I think this is not a contribution to be made, but I think this is a contribution that's already been made. That's this Nordic, I mean, I don't think you'll agree this is a Nordic way of thinking about the linkage between environment, security, and peace. But I think there is a strong tradition in this part of the world to think about these things as an integrated set of issues instead of environment management goes here and security goes here and peace building goes on the different boxes. I think this breaking silos and integrative concepts and models and way of thinking is quite natural to Nordic countries, and a lot of the decision makers share this idea of climate, peace, security have to be come together in a way that there's no security without consideration for the environment and climate. Peace also has to be making peace with the nature, having climate resilient future. So I think there's a lot of this integrative thinking comes from the tradition from sustainable development, and even starting from the 1970s. I think so the region really has already offered the world these fundamental ideas about sustainability having also integral part in peace and security. So I think that's, I would say that already the contribution has been made. I think this is now in forms of different ways of combining climate, peace, security in the forms of, for example, the climate resilient peace building is a thing now. So peace building missions try to have a climate advisors, trying to have nature-based solutions for some of the interventions. So peace building measures also include measures to reduce climate vulnerability. And also we look at climate-sensitive climate adaptations, the conflict-sensitive climate adaptation efforts, which is also a framework that shows this integration is crucial. So that's the second contribution from the Nordic countries. And the last, I think, is, well, I'm going back to, I think it was mentioned earlier yesterday about this development cooperation as something that can play a role in building climate resilience and climate resilient peace. So development cooperation, of course, you know that Nordic countries are big contributors of a lot of development cooperation fundings and also climate financing. I mean, for example, Norway is a very big contributor, and also other Nordic countries. I think, so these supports can also focus on, also include climate resilience as one of the primary or secondary goals that can be included as part of the development. Because development without climate resilience is not probably the true development. So yeah, I think these are the, well, I hope you agree, but the Nordic contribution to the world that is not trivial. I think it can also continue to be strengthened with more cooperation between countries to share these perspectives, working together on building these strong connections between climate, peace, and security in the future.
Thank you, Kyungmee. And I think this, you know, this discussion of the development and the cooperation, it provides a good mirror to bring in our next speaker, who is online. So if we can get Tobias up here. Hi, Tobias, nice to see you. You're working more or less on the development and cooperation. You're looking at the military impact or the impact of climate change on military security in the Nordic and the Arctic regions. And I think we've heard some references, for example, about the impact of, well, development to mitigate climate change in Sami regions in the Nordic, in the north, And we can imagine how great the impact of military activity is going to be in that region. So if you want to bring in some perspectives on the impact of climate change in the Nordic and the Arctic on military security.
Yes, I try to. Well, thank you very much, Silja, and for the nice introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. Apologies that I can't be there in person, but modern technology makes it possible that I at least can talk to you and participate in this very relevant and very interesting and also very timely discussion, because there is a lot of going on right now everywhere in the North, in the Arctic, and in other parts of the world in relation to climate change, but also other things. As to the Arctic has been marked as something which many academics, politicians call Arctic exceptionalism, according to which the region has been a place for constructive, pragmatic, and mainly scientific cooperation, and therefore also has been an area of low tensions, despite disagreements and tensions outside the region, which sometimes went into the region as well. But overall, the region since the Cold War has overall been peaceful, and countries were really cooperating as constructively as possible with each other. But we can also see that for the last few years, or maybe 15 to 20 years, the Arctic also has been increasingly emerging as an arena of global rivalry over military power, but also other forms of power, influence, and resources between the United States, Russia, and China. So in particular, the big global powers really have been stepping in. Obviously, Russia and the US are Arctic countries. China is not, but sees itself as a near Arctic country, and also has an increasing interest in the region, in particular in shipping lanes and the resources. And all of these countries have stepped up the Arctic engagement in recent years on the commercial level, but also on the military level. Climate change, and this is also a very important factor for developments in the Arctic, opened the region for external actors such as China, but also others, and at least part of its made part of its rich resources better accessible, although it's still very difficult to exploit them. The conditions are still harsh there, and make commercial activity not impossible, but in often cases also not really rewardable. There is a certain fear of conflicts about resources and territorium, which, however, haven't really occurred to the extent as many have predicted a couple of years ago. So the region is still relatively peaceful. There are no direct conflict resources. But at least a warmer Arctic will lead, as I said, to more commercial and civilian activity and more shipping. And this possibly could lead to more accidents and misunderstandings, the so-called gray zone operations that, for example, fish trawlers or commercial ships are used for spying activities, which we sometimes indeed can see in the region. While climate change, with all its implications, has been an issue for the region for a while, there is now a new situation in the Arctic since the beginning of last year, since Russia attacked the Ukraine and invaded Ukraine. The region is directly affected by the interaction of two ongoing global crises, namely climate change and Russia's war against Ukraine. As to climate change, scientists say that temperatures in the Arctic rise 4 times faster than the global average, and therefore the region is facing dramatic environmental changes such as melting ice, the permafrost thawing, etc., as Cedric has already mentioned. In the period of the so-called Arctic exceptionalism, climate change in a way kept the countries, including Russia, together. So they tried to through cooperation, to mitigate the effects and at least try to come up with some solutions for the direct effects of climate change for the region. But now, since we see the end of Arctic exceptionalism since the start of Russia's war against Ukraine, there is now an even greater problem for the region, which is that there is no functioning platform any longer for cooperation involving all the countries. And this lack in dialogue and cooperation and an increasing reliance on military approaches and an increasing number of military exercises bears indeed a risk of escalating conflicts, or at least miscommunication and misunderstanding. So we see a certain comeback of hard security in the Arctic region, but in the Nordic region in general, of which also NATO accession of Finland and possibly soon Sweden is clear evidence for. Because of all these factors, climate change and the ongoing global competition and global conflicts, and the Arctic is becoming increasingly strategically important for multinational forces, for NATO forces and their allies. Global warming, and this I think is a very important point, and increasing strategic competition make the necessity for military operations more likely, but at the same time also more difficult, complex and costly, as operating in this evolving, difficult environment bears many challenges, which range again from extreme and unpredictable weather conditions. Yes, maybe the Arctic becomes more accessible for shipping, but it is not easier than before to navigate. There is still ice, you still need heavy material, icebreakers. So yeah, overall navigating is not much easier than it was before. And also permafrost fall, for example, could undermine military infrastructure, ports and runways. So overall military operations become even more difficult in this current climate. And they also could reduce the constraints for force protection in the Arctic, the increasing accessibility of the Arctic and new economic opportunities and related changes in the Arctic bring forward, and I quote from a report, new security realities, including the potential for increased drone, submarine and intelligence gathering activities, and concerning signs of a strategic capabilities arms race starting in the region. And we can see indeed that already before the current crisis and already before the Crimea crisis in 2014, Russia stepped up its military activities, reopened some of the military bases from the Cold War period, and the other countries, the Western countries, are basically kind of forced to do that as well. And particularly in recent years, we see quite a lot of military activities from the American, from the Canadian, from the Nordic side in the region as well. So all these factors together increase the need for stronger multinational force situational awareness, operational capability, coordination, which I think is a very important point, and policy changes. Because so far various capability and coordination gaps, for example, insufficiency in resources and modern equipment, such as icebreakers, and missing joint command structures. For example, NATO so far does not have a joint command structure specifically for the Arctic at place, restricts the capabilities and abilities to address the current and future challenges adequately. This means that enhancing multinational force Arctic abilities requires a robust policy framework and better coordination of policies and activities in order to maintain a strong and effective security presence in the region and to ensure operational advantage towards competitors, Russia, China, in a rapidly changing climate and threat-based environment. But there is also, and this is my last point, a need for adaptation of the armed forces itself. As a consequence of climate change, armed forces have to adapt. They have to play a role both in climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. So a so-called greening of the armed forces, for example, running vehicles on renewable fuels. But this is, however, very difficult in a harsh environment such as the Arctic, where you need heavy material, which so far can only run on heavy oil, for example. So all in all, there are changes. There are many challenges for the countries of the region, for the armed forces. of the region. There is no direct Arctic conflict so far. But again, because of the difficult global situation and also perhaps positive of climate change, and we don't know yet how that will further develop, but it is predicted that climate change will have further huge implications on the Arctic, for example, when it comes to ice melting and permafrost. Will probably be better accessible, and therefore there is a certain risk that then also conflicts about resources in the Arctic itself emerge. Thank you very much.
It was really a lot of food for thought there. I'd like to encourage the audience to start thinking about questions that you might want to propose to the panel. We already have one hand. Hey, are you running the microphone? Okay. Two hands here at the front table. While we're getting that, maybe we can, just for me to put this in, where Tobias ended, the climate impact of military activity itself, of course, the more military activity that we're going to see in, with NATO's borders moving closer to Russia's borders, for example, are we going to see more military activity? How is that going to impact the climate? And of course, the living conditions, for example, of the Sami people who rely on that. But I want to invite our audience, we'll put that in there for maybe further responses. If you would introduce yourselves and state whom the question is for.
Hedman from Ocean Integrity, Iceland. Our organization is against wind turbines offshore because they are disturbing the ocean terribly. There are so many whales are being washed to the sea, and we are really, really strong in that point, because they cost a lot and they really don't do enough. And for the ocean, it's disaster. Is there any possibility that the summer in the north they will be joining with us in the ocean, to have these discussions against the wind turbines, because the amount of energy that they can bring is not that much as the cost that is wind turbines offshore or inland, they cost for people.
Okay, thank you. And you also had a question, we'll take both.
Thank you very much. Gabriel Donen from Experts for Security and Global Affairs, Romania. I have a question for all of you. But first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting subject of the panel. So my question is it advisable in the current geopolitical context and situation in the Nordic, marked by the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression over Ukraine and sanctions status imposed on the Russian Federation, to reestablish the robust dialogue and cooperation with the Russian Federation within the Arctic Council, because we know that this Arctic Council, this institution, it's a very important organization in environmental conservation, research management, and regional stability in the north. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you, Minoo, do you want to maybe address the Sami question, the wind turbines?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully captured the essence of the question, actually. So
yeah, if I understood it correctly, the question would be whether the Sami would join in on fighting against wind turbines offshore. Okay.
Well, that's difficult for me to say, but and I know the Norwegian context better than in other places. But in the context of Norway, I would be very surprised if they would not join forces. But it depends, of course, on the basis of the criticism. I think they are protesting against the wind turbine power plants on land on the basis that it's contradicting indigenous rights, so it's a human rights related issue for them. So if I don't know if your organization or if the resistance here in Iceland are also framing the wind turbine projects in the context of human rights, or or if it's other things that is kind of the foundation for the criticism. So it's difficult to say, but yeah. So I'm not able to, since I'm also not a Sami myself, I'm not able to speak on behalf of a community that I do not represent. So yeah.
Thank you. Maybe did anybody else want to respond to that one? Just because you brought up the Sami issues. If not, maybe we'll move to the other question about the lack of dialogue, and this may be Kyungmee and Tobias. If I ask you to respond, although the question is directed to all of you. What are we missing by not having the Arctic Council, the opportunity for dialogue within the Arctic Council with Russia? Tobias, do you want to start?
Yes, I can. Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, as I mentioned briefly in my input, well, this is right now one of the major problems that the traditional cooperation structures, which are indeed, as has been said, have been relatively successful and kept the countries of the region together, that they are not functioning any longer. The Arctic Council is still in existence, of course, and it also, unlike some other regional organizations or international organizations, has not suspended Russia. So Russia is still a full member of the organization. It was rather the case that last year the activities and meetings of the council have been suspended altogether. Norway took over the chairmanship, or chairship as it's called now, in May this year, and they are trying now on a very low level and very sensitively and diplomatically to at least revitalize the important working groups, which are mainly working on a scientific basis, including Russia. And apparently there is some progress. So they're trying to, but of course they have to avoid everything political. So it will be purely functional and technical. However, which that was the way the Arctic Council has been working anyway, because the countries realize we need Russia when we want to tackle the joint problems of the region, in particular in the context of climate change. And there, of course, was the consideration either to put the Arctic Council down or altogether, or to throw Russia out if that's possible. But then it's an consensus organization, so that also wouldn't have been that easy. But there was this big fear among the Western members of the Arctic Council that then Russia and together with China and probably some other countries, the BRICS countries, really still step up, which they already do anyway, and establish an alternative organization. And then we will really have a total split in the region, and that could work out quite dangerous for the entire region. So therefore, they try at least the minimum of cooperation so far as possible, hoping that there will be a regime change in Russia one day, and one can come back to including Russia fully again and having full cooperation on all areas.
Thank you. Kyungmee, I wondered if you, because we talked about the institutional platforms.
Very briefly, since I'm not an Arctic expert, but obviously the geopolitical shift and tension that's growing due to the war, and these multilateral platforms are deeply affected by the inefficiency due to Russia not being able to really fully participate, and so it just restrains this international cooperation. I think we have a paper that's just published on the Arctic from SIPRI, and it does show the importance of this new dynamics, also because of the NATO membership. So this is going to bring a big challenge, since also the governance is taking shape for the Arctic, and also you can see it in the Security Council that Russia is a P5, so it's very difficult to put any major initiatives go forward.
Thank you, Kyungmee. And Emma, of course, Finland has the probably most experience of collaborating and coordinating with Russia. So how would you see this? Somehow
a bit unlikely. I would still be careful about even or somehow allowing Russia to use this sort of scientific knowledge and data that I completely understand this is very much needed to address climate change. But I would still be very careful about allowing Russia to use it as a kind of a leverage in order to get into these organizations and to have this sort of foothold, because then I'm afraid that that could also be used in the future. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah. Did we have any more questions from the audience? I didn't see hands when we started this. Maybe, and we still have a few minutes, so feel free to raise your hand. And my colleague here, Heda, is, yep, okay. Is that Sanam? Is that you? Yep.
Thank you. You talked about wind farms on land. I'm just curious whether in the Nordic area there is offshore wind farming being planned, and whether, again, communities in the area and others, how are they seeing that in terms of the implications for fishing and or marine preservation and so forth. I don't know whether that's part of the discussion or whether there are spaces where the different sectors are talking to each other about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I can start this a little bit. There is definitely the discussion of wind farming both on land and offshore. Of course, in Denmark, there's already, we don't have any Dane here, but they already have some offshore wind turbines, but there is resistance just as much as there is interest in this here in Iceland. But do you know in your respective countries what the situation is?
In Norway, there's wind power plants both on land and also on the sea, and both are subjected to criticism, but it's the land-based wind power plants which are, where we see the most like heavy resistance, so to speak. So yeah.
Impact on bird life and
absolutely, and the scenery and the possibilities for reindeer to graze and many other things. Biodiversity loss as well, and recreational, impact or possibilities of using the beautiful landscape. It's also actually a central component of the criticism, because it's partly disrupted or destroyed, according to the critics.
Well, maybe I can say very briefly about this green and just transition is one of the key themes that SIPRI's flagship report of Environment of Peace that was published last year. So yeah, we described the impacts of wind power plants, also hydropower, which was my previous focus for the research. And there's definitely lots of social conflict happening around this, and I think in Sweden there has been mobilization against both hydropower dams and also wind farms on land. But yeah, I've also just seen the call for interest for research on the societal impacts of offshore wind farms. So I think there is probably consideration for assessing the impact more on the Swedish side.
Maybe if this sort of relates to one of your elements, the mitigating risks, of course. And we're having this discussion here, for example, with where we have these data mining centers that are, it's desirable for those who own them to put them in the Arctic, because it's easier to cool them, because we are cold regions. But then you take energy that is otherwise environmentally, friendly, but you put it to these uses instead of putting it to maybe more socially positive. It's not for household use, so then you need to dam more or put up wind turbines, etc. Do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I think that's why all of the transition risks make it exactly very important that we somehow plan the transition quite well, and we make good policy, and that we are also very careful about assessing the impacts of all kinds of actions and building these, for example, wind turbines. Finland has the experience that I think we don't have that much offshore wind power, but we have quite a lot of land wind power, and that has been actually one of the key elements that helped us in the last year with the energy crisis to get ourselves off Russian energy. So in that sense, there are many sides to this, and we do need energy from somewhere. But yeah, that puts a big responsibility on the policy making, which should be very somehow consistent and planned. And I'm not sure that we are unfortunately seeing it at the moment.
Was there any other question? Hey, is there somebody else in the?
If I just may chip in on that
Tobias,
question. If that's okay. Being a German myself, obviously, in Germany the situation is also a little bit that we have a lot of wind power in the northern part of Germany, obviously because there's more wind, and I think there overall the resistance in the population, both towards onshore as well as offshore wind power plant parks, has been relatively low. So there you really see a lot, and also they are building new ones offshore there as well. It's a bit different in the southern part of Germany, where there's more resistance, but also less wind. So generally also less wind parks. Generally in the Baltic Sea region, it's actually quite striking that there are loads of offshore wind parks in the southern part of the sea, so at the Danish and the German coast, but less further north, so Sweden, Finland, and so forth. And there are now massive attempts, in particular by the Council of the Baltic Sea States, to expand on that. So there are really plans to cooperate closer together, to also with private businesses to build more wind parks offshore in the Baltic Sea region, also in order to become more independent. So overall, there seems really to political will now in the region to expand on wind power.
Thank you. We are coming to the close of our panel. I just want to put one not so lightweight question, but and then ask you maybe to respond to that or give some closing comments. We've had over the last decade, and of course even longer, conversations about increased refugee flows because of climate change. Whether like the study that was published in Nature rather than, I think it was in Nature in around 2015, that the causality was retracted quite a bit about the impact of climate change on the start of the war in Syria. But nonetheless, we know that people are leaving hotter countries. We see these increased number of extreme weather events that are impacting people's livelihoods and homes. How can we in the Nordics respond to this, other than, of course, welcoming people who need to resettle, but where are our responsibilities and options to improve? Minoo, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think
maybe
that
1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah,
max?
sure.
Yes.
Yeah. What are our responsibilities? That's a very difficult question. But I would like to perhaps mention that often, I mean, the media focus often a lot on climate migration and climate refugees, and the way that this is often framed in media is kind of feeding into kind of an anti-migration rhetoric often, assuming that when we are talking about climate refugees, we are talking about refugees from the global south or from outside of the West or whatever we call it, and to the Western or global North. Whereas in terms of, I mean, I'm not a migration expert, but it's of course a part of the climate security nexus. So in the research, it's overwhelmingly, focused on internal migration. Climate migration is very often, or it's dominant, I would say. We talk about internally displaced communities, or communities which perhaps cross a border on land. So it's very rare that we don't have that much scientific evidence, I think, as for now, to point out a direct connection between climate change on the one hand and south-north migration or massive migration on the other. But maybe the others in the panel have more expertise on the details on migration.
Emma.
I have the level of detail that you have, and I agree completely that that's what research seems to be saying. I do think that we probably need more research, not only this sort of like, because I think it's often statistical research and having to do with numbers and how many people are escaping their homes and so on. I think we also need more maybe somehow qualitative research on the sort of patterns of migration and sort of the dynamics, understanding better why people leave, and then what would be the solution to make people more resilient also in their home regions, so that they wouldn't have to leave their homes if they don't want to, or so that they wouldn't be forced to do that, because I think most people would rather stay where they are, and it is really the climate impact that is becoming so severe that they have to leave. So that's one point. And then also kind of adding to Kyungmee's previous point about the contribution, in a way, of Nordic countries, I think we also definitely have a responsibility to continue to build up climate resilience in other parts of the world, because we have been so sort of elemental in contributing to climate change ourselves, and with the impacts being often directed to people who are very much not contributing to it so much. I think also in that sense we have a huge responsibility, and I think that it's really important now, especially with governmental changes in some of the Nordic countries, to keep up this funding and cooperation that we have had.
Thank you.
I mean, that's an excellent point, and I cannot agree more with both of your points. So it makes my job easy. But yeah, I mean, obviously, but I think the importance is to look at this overlap between conflict-affected countries and climate-exposed countries, and how much of that is really overlapping. So I think these countries are really seeing this double crisis of climate exposure with extreme weather events, climate disasters. At the same time, they're experiencing conflict, and that creates grave amount of insecurity for people, and that might obviously contributing to their decision to leave their home. Could be internal migration or international migration. That could, depending on the conditions of the international migration or internal migration conditions. So I think that's where I think the Nordic countries can also have the contribution to provide conflict-affected and fragile countries with this climate resilience support, because these countries have a very limited access to international climate financing. It's very, I think it's 1.25% of the international, there's multilateral climate funding goes to conflict-affected and very fragile countries, not just a little bit fragile countries, so very extremely fragile countries. So, I mean, that says that there's a lot of room for bilateral cooperation to support these countries targeting climate resilience that perhaps prevent displacement.
Thank you, Kyungmee. And Tobias, final comments from you.
Well, I'm not really an expert on this, but my fear is really that the number of migrants and refugees we see already right now, about which many, in particular in Europe, complain, and that there are far too many, is low in comparison to what might come when climate change, or the consequences, implications of climate change in many countries of the world, also including Europe. I mean, there are a number of countries in Europe which will be affected by rising sea levels, such as the Netherlands, and even in Norway. I think it's the question whether when sea level rises, the people can live as normal as they do now at the coast. So I think we will see quite some movement of people, both internally as well as externally.
Thank you so much. I think we've had a really full discussion, lots of issues that we need to think about further, and not just about responses, but about responsibilities. And I really appreciate all of you being here. Tobias, thank you for joining us online. Kyungmee, Emma, and Minoo, thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise. Thank you. We have coffee.